Number 1. Cassandra Bjorge, the granddaughter who wanted out. To understand how a 17-year-old girl ended up in a Gwinnett County courtroom pleading guilty to the killing of her own grandparents, you have to understand the life that Cassandra Bjorge had been living long before the spring of 2017. Cassie, as those around her called her, was born in Atlanta, Georgia, in 2000, and from the very beginning her childhood was shaped by instability. Her mother, Amanda Sterling, struggled to provide the kind of consistent, structured home environment that a growing child needs, and at some point during Cassie's early years, the decision was made that she would go to live with her maternal grandparents, Randall and Wendy Bjorge, both 63 years old, in their home in the quiet suburban community of Lawrenceville, Georgia, in Gwinnett County. By any objective measure, Randall and Wendy were not cruel or neglectful guardians. Court testimony and police interviews later revealed that they had gone to considerable lengths to provide Cassie with opportunities and experiences. They paid for her to attend a kung fu tournament in China, a remarkable investment for a working-class couple, and they maintained a structured household with clear expectations around curfews, school attendance, and relationships. They were doing what grandparents step up to do when a grandchild needs someone to hold the line, and they genuinely believed they were helping her build a better future. But for Cassie, every rule felt like a wall, and every boundary felt like a cage. Friends who knew her described her as deeply rebellious and prone to running away from the Lawrenceville home for days or even weeks at a time. There had been multiple welfare checks conducted at the Bjorge residence by the Gwinnett County Police Department prior to April 2017, called in during incidents involving Cassie and her escalating conflicts with her grandparents. The pattern was well established long before things turned catastrophic. The biggest single flashpoint in the household was Cassie's romantic relationship with Johnny Hero Ryder, an 18-year-old young man who was nearly 2 years older than her. Randall and Wendy did not approve of Ryder, and they made their disapproval known. To Cassie, their objections felt like yet another attempt to control her life and keep her confined to a home she had long since emotionally left. She wanted freedom. She wanted to be with Ryder without interference or oversight, and she wanted out of the structured, rule-bound environment her grandparents were doing their best to maintain. According to court documents, and the later confession that Cassie gave to investigators, she and Ryder began planning the killings of Randall and Wendy Bjorge days before they carried them out. The plan was methodical and deliberate. They discussed the details. They thought through the logistics. Cassie had a key to the house, which would make entry simple and silent. They waited until late at night on April 8, 2017, watching the home from outside until the lights inside went dark, and they were confident her grandparents had gone to sleep. Then they entered. What followed left the community of Lawrenceville, and soon the entire country, struggling to comprehend how two teenagers could carry out something so calculated against two elderly people who had opened their home to provide care. Once Randall and Wendy Bjorge had been killed, Cassie and Ryder took steps to conceal what had happened. They sealed parts of the home, including caulking around doors, in an effort to prevent the passage of time from making their actions detectable. Then, in one of the most disturbing aspects of a deeply disturbing case, they invited friends to the house. They ordered food. They hosted gatherings. They spent days in that home while the bodies of Randall and Wendy Bjorge remained upstairs, and the friends who came by had no idea what had happened. It was only after concerned family members, unable to reach Randall and Wendy, requested a welfare check that police came to the Lawrenceville home on April 8th and the days that followed. Officers returned multiple times beginning April 6th after requests from relatives who were growing increasingly worried about the couple. When the truth was finally discovered, investigators traced Cassie and Ryder to an apartment complex on McGuinness Ferry Road in Sewanee. The Gwinnett County SWAT team was activated and surrounded the building. When officers made entry, they found both teenagers inside, suffering from self-inflicted injuries to their wrists. They were transported to Gwinnett Medical Center for treatment before being taken into custody. Gwinnett County Police Detective Dave Bruch, who conducted the interrogation of Cassie Bjorge, later testified in court about what she told him. She described the evening of the killings in detailed terms, and, regarding her own state of mind and her feelings about her grandparents in the period leading up to that night, she said she had simply had enough of them. She had reached a breaking point and saw no other way out of the life she was living under their roof. What Bruch and other investigators found during their inquiry was a confession that was specific, coherent, and left little room for the kind of ambiguity that defense attorneys sometimes work with in cases involving young defendants. The Gwinnett County District Attorney's Office charged both Cassandra Bjorge and Johnny Ryder with murder and aggravated assault. Because Ryder was 18 at the time of the killings, he was technically eligible for the death penalty if the case went to trial. Bjorge, as a 17-year-old, was not eligible for that sentence under the law, but she faced the prospect of spending the rest of her life incarcerated. The case never went to trial. On February 2, 2018, both Cassandra Bjorge and Johnny Hero Ryder appeared before Gwinnett County Judge Deborah K. Turner and entered guilty pleas to murder, aggravated assault, and theft. The plea agreement took the death penalty off the table for Ryder. Bjorge said nothing when given the opportunity to address the court, shedding a few tears but remaining silent. Ryder spoke, telling the courtroom that he knew his actions were abominable and that he was deeply sorry for the pain he had caused the Bjorge family. Judge Turner was visibly affected by the case and made no effort to conceal it. In a statement that has since been widely reported and remembered as a striking encapsulation of the case's particular horror, she told the defendants she was stunned that they had sealed off areas of the home to prevent detection and that they had hosted parties and ordered food while two people they had killed were lying upstairs. The plea deal produced a sentence of 2 consecutive life terms for each defendant, with the possibility of parole after 60 years, plus 21 additional years to be served concurrently. For all practical purposes, both Cassandra Bjorge and Johnny Ryder will spend the rest of their lives in Georgia State Prison. Bjorge is currently incarcerated at Arundel State Prison. The Bjorge family, who spoke in court with raw and unfiltered grief, have been left to carry the weight of what happened in that Lawrenceville home. Randall's sister Sylvia Berman addressed the court and said she lives with questions she can never fully answer, wondering whether her brother and his wife understood what was happening to them and whether they could comprehend that it was their own granddaughter involved. The community of Lawrenceville, a place accustomed to the quiet rhythms of suburban Georgia life, was shaken deeply by the case. It entered the broader national conversation about juvenile crime, the limits of the structures built to protect and guide troubled young people, and the tragic reality that sometimes the most dangerous place for an elderly person can be their own home. Cassie Bjorge's case is a study in what happens when a young person's frustration with authority and desperation for a different life metastasizes into something catastrophic. She was not, by the accounts of those who knew her, a child who had been failed by every adult in her life. She was a child who had been given structure by grandparents who genuinely cared, who found that structure intolerable, and who ultimately chose the most irreversible possible response to a conflict that could have been resolved in 1,000 other ways. She is expected to remain incarcerated well into the second half of the 21st century. Number 2. Marie Robards, the chemistry student who chose poison. Marie Robards was, by almost every visible measure, exactly the kind of teenager her Fort Worth, Texas community wanted to celebrate. Born Dorothy Marie Robards on July 10, 1976, she was a strong student, academically oriented, and had ambitions to pursue a career in medicine, specifically pathology. She was bright, presentable, and gave no outward sign of the desperation building beneath the surface of her carefully maintained exterior. But inside the Robards household, and inside Marie's mind, a plan had been forming that would eventually strip away every comfortable assumption the people around her had made about who she was. To understand why Marie Robards did what she did in February of 1993, you have to understand the architecture of her family life. Her parents, Stephen Robards and Beth Lomer, had divorced back in 1980, when Marie was still very young. Her mother had remarried a man named Frank Burroughs in 1981 and had built a new life. Marie had spent years moving between the two households, navigating the complicated terrain of a split family, and by 1992, she had ended up living with her father, Stephen, in an apartment in East Fort Worth, while she attended Mansfield High School. Stephen Robards was a hospital worker, and by the accounts available from the case record, he was not physically cruel to Marie. But the living arrangement was one she had not chosen, and one she deeply resented. She wanted to live with her mother. She wanted out of her father's apartment and the custody arrangement that kept her there. She felt trapped, and she began to think about what it would take to change her situation. What Marie ultimately arrived at was not a confrontation, not a legal challenge to the custody arrangement, and not a plea to her mother or a social worker. It was chemistry. Specifically, it was barium acetate, a highly toxic compound that she accessed from the chemistry lab at her school. She was an excellent chemistry student, and she understood precisely what barium acetate did to the human body, and at what dose it became fatal. She even removed the relevant page from the school's chemical safety manual, a deliberate act that investigators would later point to as evidence of premeditation, so that she could handle the substance without endangering herself while she used it on her father. On the evening of February 17, 1993, Stephen Robards was at home eating takeout Mexican food, specifically tacos and refried beans. Marie slipped a lethal quantity of the chemical into his food. Stephen Robards became severely ill shortly afterward. His neighbor, Sandra Hudgens, was called for help. Paramedics arrived and tried to stabilize him, but Stephen Robards died that evening. Marie said nothing about what she had done. She watched as paramedics worked, and she remained silent. Because detecting barium acetate in a human body requires a highly specialized piece of equipment, a mass spectrometer and gas chromatograph valued at approximately $150,000, equipment that the Tarrant County Medical Examiner's Office did not own. The initial cause of death was attributed to cardiac arrest. Stephen Robards was 38 years old. The ruling was straightforward, the case was closed, and Marie went on with her life. She went back to school. She got a part in her high school production of Shakespeare's Hamlet. She performed the role. She kept the secret. But secrets of this magnitude tend to find their way out, and Marie Robards' secret was no exception. The vehicle for its exposure was her closest friend, a girl named Stacey High. Sometime after her father's death, in a moment of apparent overwhelming guilt, Marie confided in Stacey. She told her what she had done and how she had done it. She made Stacey promise not to tell anyone. Stacey tried. But the knowledge of what Marie had told her began to destroy her. She suffered nightmares. Her academic performance at Sam Houston State University collapsed. Her mental health deteriorated significantly as the weight of the secret she was carrying became unbearable. Eventually, she told her mother, and her mother went to authorities. The case was reopened in 1994. Investigators obtained the specialized toxicology testing that had not been available at the time of Stephen Robards' death, and the results changed everything. The cause of death was reclassified from cardiac arrest to acute barium intoxication. Marie Robards was arrested. She was 16 when she committed the act, and 17 when she was charged. The case went to trial in 1995 and attracted significant media attention, both because patricide, the killing of a parent, is statistically rare, and because it is even more rarely committed by a teenage girl who appeared to be a promising, high-achieving student. At trial, prosecutors argued that Marie had known exactly what she was doing every step of the way. They pointed to the fact that she had removed the safety manual page, demonstrating clear awareness of what the chemical could do. They noted that she had administered a quantity 28 times the lethal dose, not an accident, and not a miscalculation, but a deliberate act of certainty. Prosecutor Mitch Poe told the jury in his closing argument that making her father sick would not have been enough to get Marie back to her mother's house, and that Stephen Robards had to die for her plan to work. The defense argued that Marie had not fully understood the lethality of what she was doing, a claim that the jury rejected. Marie took the stand during the sentencing phase of the trial, speaking in a trembling voice and stating that she had never been convicted of a crime before. She wept and told the court she was deeply sorry. The jury convicted her of first-degree murder and sentenced her to 27 years in prison. Inside the prison system, Marie Robards was by all accounts a model inmate. She followed the rules, kept out of trouble, and conducted herself in a way that eventually made a strong case for her early release. In 2003, after serving approximately 8 years of her 27-year sentence, she was granted parole. She was released and is believed to be living today under a new private identity. She married at some point after her release and is thought to have rebuilt a quiet, private life far from the glare of the case that defined her adolescence. The case itself left an enduring mark on the true crime landscape, appearing on Forensic Files and the television series Deadly Women, and it became a subject of significant academic interest precisely because it defied so many assumptions about who commits this type of crime and why. Stephen Robards, the man at the center of it all, was a 38-year-old hospital worker who sat down to eat his dinner one February evening and never stood back up. His death, the product of a plan his own daughter had been quietly building in the chemistry classroom where she was considered one of the best students in the room. Number 3. Stacey Lannert, the daughter who carried a secret for 9 years. The story of Stacey Lannert is one that the American legal system spent nearly 2 decades trying to resolve, ultimately landing in a place that left many legal observers, domestic abuse advocates, and members of the public deeply divided about the relationship between justice, trauma, and the laws that were designed to account for both. Stacey Ann Lannert was born on May 28, 1972, in St. Louis, Missouri, and grew up in the working-class community of St. John, a small city in St. Louis County. She was, by the time she reached her teenage years, living through something that she told no one about and that she carried in complete silence through every ordinary day of her adolescent life. Beginning when she was approximately 8 years old, Stacey testified that her father, Thomas Lannert, began subjecting her to repeated sexual abuse. She said the abuse continued for roughly 9 years, happening as often as 3 times a week, and that her father maintained her silence through threats and intimidation that made disclosure feel impossible. She had a younger sister, Christy, who was 15 years old by the time of the events of July 4, 1990. Stacey testified that she feared her father had begun to direct his abusive behavior toward Christy as well, and that this fear became a driving factor in the decision she made on that 4th of July. Earlier that year, Stacey had tried another approach. She had moved out of her father's home and tried to persuade him to allow Christy to come and live with her. He refused. The girls were, for different reasons, trapped in circumstances they could not escape through conventional means, and Stacey believed she was running out of time and options. On the early morning hours of July 4, 1990, Stacey and Christy returned home late, entering the house through a basement window at approximately 4:15 in the morning. Stacey, now 18 years old, saw a rifle in the home. In the account she gave to investigators, she described the moment as one in which she made a decision that had been building inside her for years. She found her father, Tom Lannert, asleep on the living room sofa. She fired the rifle at him. The first shot woke him. Stacey closed her eyes and fired again. Tom Lannert died from his wounds. In the hours that followed, Stacey contacted an adult friend who helped her dispose of the weapon, and she later called police, initially presenting the situation as though she had discovered her father. But when Detective Tom Schulte began questioning her, asking gently whether there had been any abuse in the family home, Stacey broke down completely. She confessed that she was the one who had fired the rifle, and she began to describe the years of abuse she said she had endured at her father's hands. Schulte later said that what Stacey told him that day was among the most compelling and heartbreaking accounts he had encountered in his 30-year career in law enforcement, and it became the foundation of what would eventually be a very public and very long fight for Stacey's freedom. The legal proceedings that followed produced a result that many people found deeply troubling. At trial, the jury was instructed that they could not consider Stacey's account of the abuse she had suffered as a mitigating factor under Missouri's self-defense law, because the legal standard required that the person be in immediate physical danger at the moment of the act, and Tom Lannert had been asleep when Stacey fired. The jury convicted her of first-degree murder and armed criminal action. Under Missouri law, first-degree murder carries a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Stacey Lannert, 18 years old, was sent to prison for the rest of her natural life. 4 of the jurors later signed affidavits stating that they believed the sentence was too harsh given the circumstances they had been made aware of, and a lieutenant from the St. John Police Department also expressed misgivings about the outcome. Detective Schulte, the same man who had taken Stacey's original confession, spent years working toward her release, saying he had made a promise to her that day in the interrogation room and intended to keep it. He went to multiple Missouri governors seeking clemency on her behalf. The case attracted national attention over the following decade and a half, appearing in media coverage that exposed the gap between the legal framework for self-defense claims and the complex realities of long-term domestic abuse. Abuse survivors' advocates argued that Stacey's case illustrated a fundamental failure in how the law treated victims who had reached a breaking point after years of sustained trauma rather than a single acute incident. Then, on January 10, 2009, outgoing Missouri Governor Matt Blunt issued a statement commuting Stacey Lannert's sentence, along with that of another woman, Charity Carey, who had been convicted under similar circumstances. Governor Blunt stated that after an exhaustive review of the facts in both cases, he was commuting the sentences of both women who had suffered extensive abuse before taking the actions that led to their convictions. Stacey's new sentence of 20 years made her eligible for immediate conditional release, and on January 16, 2009, after 18 years of incarceration, Stacey Lannert walked out of the WERRDC facility in Vandalia, Missouri, a free woman. The prosecutor's office in St. Louis County responded with fury, with prosecuting attorney Bob McCulloch publicly condemning the governor's action in terms that made his position unmistakably clear. The release was a flashpoint in the ongoing national debate about how the legal system should handle cases involving abuse survivors who reach a point of fatal response. Since her release, Stacey Lannert has built a life of considerable public purpose. She earned a degree in psychology from Southeast Missouri State University in 2014. She founded a resource website and a nonprofit organization called Healing Sisters, dedicated to providing support and aid to women who have experienced abuse. She has spoken publicly about her own experiences and has said that she regrets the loss of her father's life and wishes things could have been different. Today she works as a public defender, advocating for others within the same legal system that once sentenced her to die behind bars. Her case remains one of the most significant and frequently discussed examples of the tension between the letter of the law and the lived reality of abuse survivors, and it continues to appear in legal education, documentary programming, and policy discussions about how self-defense law should be reformed to account for the experiences of people like Stacey Lannert. Number 4. Jasmine Richardson, Canada's youngest triple murderer. Medicine Hat, Alberta, is a mid-sized city in the southeastern corner of the Canadian prairies, the kind of place where people tend to know their neighbors, and where a family tragedy registers across the whole community, rather than getting lost in an urban crowd. It was in Medicine Hat, on the night of April 23, 2006, that 12-year-old Jasmine Richardson and her 23-year-old boyfriend Jeremy Steinke entered the Richardson family home and ended the lives of Jasmine's parents, Mark Richardson, 40, and Deborah Richardson, 48, and her younger brother Jacob, 8 years old. The case became one of the most discussed criminal proceedings in Canadian history, and it forced an entire country to reckon with questions it was not prepared to answer about juvenile crime, online relationships, parental authority, and the laws designed to protect young people from consequences they are not yet equipped to understand. Jasmine Richardson had met Jeremy Steinke through an online connection. He was 23, she was 12, and the nature of their relationship was one that her parents, Mark and Deborah, had discovered and taken immediate steps to end. They found Steinke wholly unsuitable, and with good reason. The age gap alone would have been sufficient cause for serious concern, but Steinke also cultivated a persona centered on Gothic imagery, darkness, and a self-identification with vampirism that he displayed openly in online forums and in his personal presentation. He had described himself in online posts as a 300-year-old werewolf and had posted content that raised deep concerns about his state of mind. Mark and Deborah Richardson did what any reasonable parents would do. They forbade Jasmine from seeing Steinke. They attempted to monitor her online activity. They tried to cut off the relationship entirely, but Jasmine and Steinke had no intention of accepting that outcome. In the weeks leading up to April 23, the two communicated about the Richardsons, and Steinke made statements in online posts and direct messages that left no ambiguity about what he was thinking. He expressed a desire to see Mark and Deborah Richardson dead. Jasmine, for her part, expressed fury at her parents and at her brother, who she felt was treated better than she was. The two made plans, On the evening of April 23, 2006, Steinke arrived at the Richardson home, while Mark and Deborah were there. He also encountered 8-year-old Jacob. What happened inside that home that night ended 3 lives and left a community in permanent grief. Mark Richardson was killed. Deborah Richardson was killed. Jacob Richardson, 8 years old, was killed. After the killings, Steinke and Jasmine left the house together. They were found by police the following day. The investigation moved quickly. Both Steinke and Jasmine were taken into custody. The evidence against them, including the online communications in which both had discussed what they wanted to happen to Jasmine's family, was extensive and damning. Jeremy Steinke was tried as an adult in Canadian court. He was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to 3 concurrent life terms in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for 25 years. Jasmine Richardson's case was far more complicated from a legal standpoint. She was 12 years old at the time of the killings, which made her the youngest person in Canadian history to be convicted of multiple murders. Under Canada's Youth Criminal Justice Act, the maximum sentence available for a young offender, regardless of the severity of the crime, is 10 years. After extensive psychological evaluation and legal proceedings that drew national scrutiny and provoked intense debate about whether the Youth Criminal Justice Act was equipped to deal with a case of this magnitude, Jasmine Richardson was convicted on 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to the maximum available term of 10 years. A significant portion of that time was served in supervised psychiatric treatment and community custody arrangements rather than in a traditional detention facility, which itself became a source of public controversy. Jasmine Richardson completed her sentence and was released in 2016. Under the Youth Criminal Justice Act, her identity had been protected throughout the proceedings, and the publication ban that shielded her name was eventually lifted only after she had already been released and was living under a new identity. The release was met with a mixture of responses across Canada, with victims' advocates, legal scholars, and members of the public deeply divided about whether the sentences available under the Youth Justice Framework were adequate for a crime of this severity, and whether Jasmine Richardson's rehabilitation had been genuine and complete. Jeremy Steinke remains incarcerated. The case has since been examined in numerous documentaries and true crime analyses, and it continues to be cited in Canadian policy discussions about the appropriate limits and capabilities of the Youth Criminal Justice Act when confronted with juvenile offenders involved in serious violent crime. The Richardson family, Mark, Deborah, and 8-year-old Jacob, are remembered in Medicine Hat as people whose lives were taken in the most unimaginable of circumstances by individuals who should have had no power to harm them. Number 5. Cyntoia Brown, the girl the system failed twice. Few cases in the history of American criminal justice have generated the volume of public debate, celebrity advocacy, legal scholarship, and legislative response that the case of Cyntoia Brown produced in the years following her 2006 trial in Nashville, Tennessee. Her story began not with the night of August 6, 2004, when she was 16 years old and shot 43-year-old Johnny Mitchell Allen in his home after he solicited her for commercial sex, but much earlier, in a childhood defined by circumstances so difficult and so damaging that by the time she was 16, she was living a life that no child should ever have to inhabit. Cyntoia Brown was born in 1988. Her biological mother, Georgina Mitchell, struggled significantly with substance dependency during and after her pregnancy, and experts who later evaluated Cyntoia testified that she showed signs consistent with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, a condition that affects brain development and impulse control, and that would become a central element of her legal defense. Cyntoia was adopted and grew up in a home that was ultimately unable to provide the stability she needed. By her early teens, she was in a state of significant distress, eventually running away from home and ending up on the streets of Nashville with no money, no support network, and no adult figure who could be trusted to protect her. It was in this context that she came under the influence of a man who went by the street name Cut Throat, later identified as Garyon McLaughlin, a man involved in criminal activity who began controlling Cyntoia and directing her into commercial sexual exploitation. She was 16 years old. She had nowhere else to go, and no one she believed could help her. On August 6, 2004, McLaughlin directed Cyntoia to go with a man named Johnny Mitchell Allen, a 43-year-old Nashville real estate agent and licensed gun dealer, who had picked her up and offered her money for sex. Allen took Cyntoia to his home. She later testified that she believed Allen posed a threat to her life, describing specific behaviors and statements he made inside the house that she interpreted as signs that he intended to harm her. At some point during that night, Cyntoia Brown fired a single shot at Johnny Mitchell Allen while he was lying in his bed. He did not survive. Cyntoia took some of his possessions, including a firearm and cash, before leaving the home. She was found by police the following day. The case went to trial in 2006, and the prosecution argued straightforwardly that Cyntoia Brown had gone to Allen's home, taken his life, and stolen his property, constituting first-degree murder and aggravated robbery. The defense attempted to present the full context of Cyntoia's life and the circumstances that led her to that house that night, including her exploitation by McLaughlin, her diagnosis with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and her subjective belief that she was in danger at the moment she fired. Tennessee law at the time applied a mandatory sentencing structure to first-degree murder convictions that left the jury with limited options. Cyntoia Brown was convicted of first-degree murder and aggravated robbery and sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole not available until she had served 51 calendar years. She was 16. Under the sentence as imposed, she would not be eligible for parole consideration until she was 69 years old. The sentence produced no immediate public response beyond the courtroom, and Cyntoia Brown began serving her time at the Tennessee Prison for Women. But the case did not remain quiet. A documentary filmmaker named Daniel Berman had documented Cyntoia's story in the period leading up to and during her trial, and the resulting film, Me Facing Life, Cyntoia's Story, was broadcast on PBS in 2011. It brought her case to a much wider audience. Then, in 2017, a combination of social media attention and advocacy from prominent public figures, including musicians, actors, and human rights organizations, brought Cyntoia Brown's case into one of the most visible national conversations about juvenile justice, sex trafficking, and the question of whether the American legal system adequately accounts for the backgrounds and circumstances of the young people it sentences. The American Civil Liberties Union, the Tennessee Justice Center, and numerous academic and advocacy organizations filed briefs and issued statements in support of reconsidering her sentence. In 2019, the Tennessee Supreme Court issued a ruling clarifying the nature of her sentence, affirming that she would indeed need to serve 51 years before becoming parole eligible unless executive action was taken. Then, on January 7, 2019, Tennessee Governor Bill Haslam granted Cyntoia Brown executive clemency, commuting her sentence and making her eligible for release. He cited her record of rehabilitation while incarcerated, including educational achievements, mentorship activities, and consistent engagement with programming designed to help her grow. On August 8, 2019, after nearly 15 years in prison, Cyntoia Brown was released. She had entered prison as a 16-year-old with a life sentence and left as a young woman who had earned a college degree while incarcerated, married her husband Jamie Long while still behind bars, and committed herself publicly to advocacy on behalf of other survivors of trafficking and exploitation. She published a memoir, Free Cyntoia: My Search for Redemption in the American Prison System, in 2019, and has continued to speak publicly about her experiences. Her case produced concrete legislative change in Tennessee, which passed the Cyntoia Brown Law in 2021, requiring courts to consider trafficking victimization as a mitigating factor in criminal cases involving juveniles. The law carries her name as a permanent acknowledgement that her story revealed something the existing system had been inadequate to address. Johnny Mitchell Allen's family, for their part, has maintained that he was the victim of a crime and that his life deserved to be treated with the same seriousness as the circumstances that surrounded his death. The tension between those two positions, each held by real people with real grief, is at the heart of why the case of Cyntoia Brown remains one of the most morally complex and consequential juvenile justice cases in modern American history. Number 6. Pieper Lewis, the runaway who had no one to run to. There is a version of Pieper Lewis's story that is easy to reduce to a single line, and there is a version that requires the full weight of everything that happened before the moment that defined her legal fate. The full version begins not in June of 2020, when she was 15 years old and took the life of a 37-year-old man named Zachary Brooks in Des Moines, Iowa, but years before that, in a home environment so unstable and so unsafe that running away from it felt like the only possible act of self-preservation. Pieper Lewis had grown up in circumstances shaped by inconsistency, neglect, and documented instability in her family home. By the time she was 15, she had reached a point where staying felt more dangerous than leaving, and she made the decision to run. But running away when you are 15 and have no money, no resources, and no network of trustworthy adults does not lead to safety. It leads to vulnerability of a specific and devastating kind. After leaving her home, Pieper came under the influence of a man named Zachary de Rouleau, who presented himself as someone offering help, but who was in fact directing her into commercial sexual exploitation. He placed her with Zachary Brooks, an adult man who was part of his network, and Brooks was among those to whom de Rouleau made Pieper available for sex against her will. This happened on multiple occasions. On the morning of the specific incident in June 2020, Brooks had, according to Pieper's account, subjected her to a rape. She was 15 years old. After the assault, in a state of acute distress and terror, she took a knife and stabbed Zachary Brooks. He died from his injuries. Pieper Lewis did not flee. She remained at the scene. She was taken into custody by Des Moines police, and the investigation began. What investigators found was a 15-year-old girl who had been trafficked, who had experienced repeated sexual assault, and who had been placed in a situation entirely outside her ability to control or escape through any conventional means. The case went through the Iowa court system over the following 2 years and generated significant public attention, particularly as advocates for trafficking survivors argued that what Pieper had done was an act of survival rather than criminal conduct in any conventional sense. In 2022, she entered a guilty plea to charges of voluntary manslaughter and willful injury. The initial sentencing hearing, in September of 2022, produced an outcome that shocked many observers and drew intense national criticism. Judge David M. Porter sentenced Pieper Lewis to 5 years of supervised probation rather than prison time. He also ordered her to pay restitution in the amount of $150,000 to the estate of Zachary Brooks, the man she had said repeatedly assaulted her. The restitution order, which required a trafficking survivor and victim of repeated sexual assault to pay money to the estate of her abuser, was condemned by victims' rights organizations, anti-trafficking advocates, and legal scholars across the country. Iowa law, they pointed out, mandated restitution in cases of this type and gave the judge limited discretion to override it. The case of Pieper Lewis was cited in multiple state legislatures as an example of why reform of restitution laws in trafficking-related cases was urgently needed. The probation period that followed was not straightforward. Pieper Lewis faced multiple violations of the terms of her supervision, some involving behaviors that her supporters attributed to the profound and lasting trauma she had experienced and the inadequacy of the support structures available to her. Each violation brought her back before the court and closer to the imposition of the original 20-year prison sentence that had been suspended. On May 15, 2026, after years of legal proceedings, hearings, and continued public attention, Judge Porter imposed the full 20-year sentence that had been held in suspension. The ruling set off an immediate new wave of public outcry, with advocates arguing that incarcerating a trafficking survivor for this length of time for an act committed at 15 during a period of exploitation represented one of the most significant failures of the American justice system's treatment of trafficking victims in recent memory. Pieper Lewis, now in her early 20s, is currently serving that sentence. The case has become a central reference point in national policy conversations about how the legal system should treat juvenile survivors of trafficking who respond to their exploitation and abuse with force, and it has contributed to legislative efforts in multiple states to reform the way courts handle these cases. Zachary De Rouleau, the man who trafficked Pieper and placed her with Zachary Brooks, was also prosecuted. The broader tragedy of Pieper Lewis's story is that it began with a teenager who ran away from a dangerous home situation, looking for safety, found something far worse, and ended up carrying the legal consequences of that encounter for the foreseeable future of her adult life. Number 7. Chrystul Kizer, the case that changed Wisconsin law. When Chrystul Kizer was 17 years old and living in Kenosha, Wisconsin, she had already been identified by law enforcement as a victim of sex trafficking. The man responsible for her exploitation, Randall Philip Volar III, 34, was already under active investigation by the Kenosha Police Department at the time of the events of June 5, 2018, suspected of sexually abusing multiple girls, some as young as 12 years old. Investigators had a file on Volar. They had evidence. They had reason to believe he was dangerous to the young women and girls in his orbit. And yet Volar remained free, and Chrystul Kizer remained in a situation from which she could not extract herself through any of the channels that were theoretically available to her. Chrystul's background was one shaped by poverty, family instability, and an early exposure to conditions that made her particularly vulnerable to the kind of predatory recruitment that Volar engaged in. She had been introduced to him through the commercial sex market that he was running, and by the time she was 17, she was enmeshed in a situation that was not of her choosing and from which, from her perspective, there was no clear path out. Volar used money, drugs, and the mechanisms of control typical of trafficking operations to maintain his hold over the girls he exploited. On June 5, 2018, Chrystul Kizer went to Volar's home in Kenosha. At some point during that encounter, she shot Randall Volar. She also set fire to his home before leaving. Volar died. Chrystul was found and taken into custody. The charges filed against her were severe. She was charged with first-degree intentional homicide, arson, and vehicle theft. If convicted, she faced the possibility of life in prison. What followed was one of the most closely watched criminal cases in Wisconsin in years, and it produced a legal ruling at the state's highest court level that fundamentally altered how Wisconsin law handles these situations. The central legal question was whether Chrystul Kizer had the right to invoke an affirmative defense under Wisconsin's human trafficking statute, a provision that was designed to protect trafficking victims from criminal prosecution for offenses committed as a direct result of their trafficking situation. The prosecution argued she could not use that defense. The defense argued she could. Lower courts sided with the prosecution. The case reached the Wisconsin Supreme Court, which in 2022 issued a landmark ruling holding that Chrystul Kizer did have the right to present the affirmative trafficking defense to a jury. The decision was seen as a historic victory for trafficking survivors' rights advocates across the country and as a significant development in the evolving legal framework for how states should treat victims who commit offenses in the context of their exploitation. The ruling drew national attention and was cited extensively in legal scholarship and advocacy as evidence that the law was beginning to reckon more honestly with the complex realities of trafficking. With the affirmative defense available to her, the legal landscape of Chrystul Kizer's case changed significantly. Rather than proceeding to a trial on the original charges, the case was resolved through a negotiated plea. In May of 2024, Chrystul Kizer pleaded guilty to second-degree reckless homicide, a substantially reduced charge from the original first-degree intentional homicide she had faced. On August 19, 2024, she was sentenced to 11 years in prison, followed by 5 years of extended supervision. The sentence acknowledged the complexity of her circumstances, including the documented fact that she had been a trafficking victim and that the man she killed had been actively under investigation for the exploitation of minors at the time of his death. Randall Volar's history became a significant element of the case's public framing. The fact that law enforcement had been investigating him, had evidence of his conduct, and had not yet acted to remove him from the situations he was creating for vulnerable young women was a recurring point of discussion in advocacy circles and in media coverage. The question of what might have happened to Chrystul Kizer and to other girls in Volar's orbit if law enforcement had moved more quickly against him was one that the case raised without fully answering. Chrystul Kizer's case became a catalyst for legislative review of Wisconsin's trafficking statutes and contributed to broader national conversations about the systemic failures that leave young trafficking victims without adequate protection. She is currently serving her sentence. The Wisconsin Supreme Court ruling that her case produced will have legal implications extending far beyond her individual situation, establishing precedent for how trafficking victims in Wisconsin can defend themselves against criminal charges for acts committed in the context of their exploitation. Number 8. Sierra Halseth, the Las Vegas daughter, who chose the irreversible. Las Vegas, Nevada, is a city that tends to generate its share of dramatic stories, but the case that unfolded in the spring of 2021 involving 16-year-old Sierra Halseth and her 18-year-old boyfriend, Aaron Guerrero, was one that even experienced investigators found difficult to fully absorb. At the center of it was a conflict that began with something recognizable to many families: parents trying to prevent a teenage daughter from pursuing a relationship they considered harmful, and a teenager who refused to accept that authority. and ended in a way that no one who has not confronted the full weight of the case could have anticipated. Sierra Halseth had begun dating Aaron Guerrero in the summer of 2020. She was 16 and he was 18. According to court records, the relationship progressed quickly, and the two developed plans to leave Las Vegas together and relocate to Los Angeles. They wanted to be free of their respective families and to build a life together on their own terms. When their parents became aware of those plans and intervened, prohibiting the teenagers from continuing to see each other, the relationship was officially ended in December 2020. But Sierra and Aaron did not accept that outcome. They continued to communicate and to plan. At some point in the months that followed, their planning took a turn that would end in the death of Sierra's father, Daniel Halseth, a 45-year-old Las Vegas resident. On April 9, 2021, Daniel Halseth's remains were discovered inside his home on the northwest side of Las Vegas. The circumstances in which he was found were among the most disturbing details of an already harrowing case. He had been subjected to an extreme level of harm. Investigators documented the full extent of what had been done to him and the apparent attempt to conceal what had taken place inside the home. The two teenagers had purchased a circular saw blades, bleach, lighter fluid, disposable gloves, and a drop cloth from stores near the home in the period immediately preceding the discovery. Aaron Guerrero had run away from his own family home the day before Daniel Halseth's remains were found. The two were located by police 4 days after the discovery, in Utah, and taken into custody. Among the evidence recovered was a video on Sierra Halseth's phone in which the two were heard discussing what they had done in a manner that investigators described as casual and untroubled. That video became one of the most damning pieces of evidence in the case. Daniel Halseth's family spoke with devastating grief throughout the legal proceedings. His sister called what Sierra and Aaron had done unforgivable and stated publicly that she believed both defendants should have faced the most severe sentence available under Nevada law. His mother described being haunted by the events. At the sentencing hearing, Sierra Halseth addressed the court and alleged that her father had subjected her to physical and sexual abuse during her upbringing, and that the trauma of that abuse had shaped the person she became and the decisions she made. Her attorney acknowledged that the evidence in the case did not allow him to corroborate all of Sierra's specific claims, but stated that he believed there had to have been a reason for what she had done, that something had to have been driving behavior this extreme. Aaron Guerrero also addressed the court and offered an apology to Daniel Halseth's family. The legal resolution of the case came through a plea agreement that both defendants accepted in May of 2022, pleading guilty to murder with a deadly weapon, conspiracy to commit murder, arson, robbery with a deadly weapon, conspiracy to commit robbery, and 4 counts of fraudulent use of a credit or debit card. The plea agreement was structured to remove the death penalty as a possibility for Guerrero, who had been 18 at the time of the crime. On October 20th, 2022, Sierra Halseth and Aaron Guerrero were each sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 22 years. Sierra was 19 years old at the time of sentencing. The case generated extensive media coverage in Nevada and nationally, and it became a reference point in discussions about teenage intimate relationships, parental intervention, and the question of at what point the impulse of young people to escape parental control crosses from ordinary adolescent rebellion into something far more dangerous. Daniel Halseth was 45 years old. Whatever the full truth of the relationship between him and his daughter, he did not survive the consequences of a plan that 2 teenagers devised to free themselves from the constraints placed on their relationship by their families. Number 9. Tasmiyah and Jasmiyah Whitehead. When twins share the worst decision of their lives. The case of Tasmiyah and Jasmiyah Whitehead, twin sisters, who were each 16 years old when they took their mother's life inside their family home in Conyers, Georgia, on January 13, 2010, is one that forces a sustained engagement with questions about intergenerational family dysfunction, the adequacy of child welfare intervention, and the specific and terrible reality that the systems designed to protect children from harmful home environments are, in too many cases, engaged with the situation for years without ever producing the kind of meaningful change that might have altered the trajectory that ended in tragedy. Jasmiyah Whitehead, known to her community as Nikki, was 30 years old on the morning she died. She was the mother of the twin girls and the product of a family history that the case record describes in terms that multiple social workers, investigators, and advocates characterized as representing cycles of dysfunction reaching back multiple generations within the family. The Whitehead household had been known to child welfare authorities. There was a documented history of conflict and difficulty. The twins, by the accounts gathered during the investigation and the subsequent legal proceedings, had experienced a childhood that included instability, exposure to circumstances that were not appropriate for children, and a relationship with their mother that social workers who encountered the family described as deeply troubled and marked by patterns that had been visible and documented long before January 13, 2010. What specific events, dynamics, and conditions within the Whitehead household produced the level of desperation, or rage, or accumulated grievance that led Tasmiyah and Jasmiyah to do what they did on that January morning is something that the case record provides only a partial account of, and it is one of the aspects of the case that has made it particularly difficult for advocates working on both juvenile justice and child welfare to fully analyze. What is documented is that on January 13, 2010, both twins participated in an attack on their mother inside the Conyers family home that resulted in Nikki Whitehead's death. She was 30 years old. Both daughters were taken into custody. They were 16 years old at the time of the offense and were charged as adults, a decision that reflected both the severity of the crime and Georgia's approach to the question of when juvenile offenders should be processed within the adult criminal justice system. The legal proceedings that followed took several years to reach a final resolution, longer than observers expected, given that both girls were in custody and the basic facts of what had occurred inside the Whitehead home were not subject to serious factual dispute. Both Tasmiyah and Jasmiyah ultimately entered guilty pleas to the charge of murder. The sentencing occurred in 2013, when both sisters had aged into their late teens during the period of pretrial incarceration. Each received a sentence of 30 years in state prison, with the possibility that parole consideration could occur before the full 30 years had elapsed if the parole board found, based on the evidence of rehabilitation and conduct available to it, that early release was appropriate. The sentences imposed on both sisters meant that they would be in their mid to late 40s before completing their terms if they served the full sentence, and middle-aged before any parole consideration was available if the board's evaluation did not produce an earlier outcome. The child welfare advocacy community's response to the case focused significantly on the documented history of the family and on the question of whether interventions that had occurred in the period before January 13, 2010, had been adequate. Social workers and family welfare advocates argued consistently that the pattern of difficulty and dysfunction visible in the Whitehead household had been known to the relevant authorities, that the household had been the subject of involvement from child welfare systems, and that the interventions that had occurred in response to that involvement had not produced the kind of meaningful improvement in the family's functioning that might have changed the course of events. The argument was not that Tasmiyah and Jasmiyah Whitehead bore no responsibility for what they had done, because the legal proceedings made clear that they did, and the guilty pleas reflected a legal acceptance of that responsibility. The argument was that the system whose job it is to identify dangerous family situations and intervene in them before they produce irreversible outcomes had been present in the Whitehead family's life and had not succeeded in producing a different trajectory. Nikki Whitehead was 30 years old when she died in her own home. Whatever the full complexity of her relationship with her daughters, whatever the history of the household they had grown up in together, and whatever the circumstances that produced the morning of January 13, 2010, she was a mother whose life was taken by the daughters she had raised, and the grief of that loss has extended beyond her immediate family to a broader community that has found the case difficult to fully process, precisely because it defies the simple narratives that people often reach for when trying to make sense of something this extreme. Number 10. Cynthia Alvarez, the Compton daughter who gave up on finding another way out. The story of Cynthia Alvarez begins not on the night in October 2011 when she and her 16-year-old boyfriend Giovanni Gallardo carried out the killings of her mother Gloria Villalta and her stepfather Jose Lara in the family's Compton, California mobile home, but years earlier, in a childhood defined by the specific kind of instability that comes from losing a parent to circumstances entirely outside a child's control, and being raised in conditions that are characterized as much by emotional difficulty as by any outward appearance of normalcy. Cynthia's father had been deported back to Honduras when she was very young, a removal that created in Cynthia's life a permanent absence around which her sense of family and belonging had to arrange itself imperfectly. She grew up in the Compton mobile home with her mother Gloria, her stepfather Jose Lara, and her older sister Diana Villalta, in circumstances that Cynthia later described in court as ones in which she experienced ongoing physical mistreatment at the hands of her mother and sexual assault at the hands of her stepfather. These were claims that the prosecution disputed vigorously, and that family members and people who knew Gloria and Jose Lara denied entirely, presenting both adults as imperfect but genuinely caring people who had done their best for Cynthia within the limits of their circumstances and resources. The competing accounts of what life in that Compton mobile home had actually been like for Cynthia Alvarez were never definitively resolved by the legal proceedings, and the truth of what she experienced as a child is not something that the available record allows an outside observer to establish with certainty. What is documented is that Cynthia was identified by her school as having learning disabilities and was enrolled in the special education program at Dominguez High School in Compton, where she met Giovanni Gallardo in 2010. Gallardo, who was the same age as Cynthia, had also been diagnosed with cognitive disabilities. His IQ had been measured at 57 by a psychological evaluator, placing him in a range that mental health professionals described as significantly affecting his capacity for judgment and his vulnerability to influence. The two began dating and developed, by Cynthia's own account, a bond that she experienced as the most significant source of warmth and validation in her life at the time. She testified that Gallardo treated her with the kind of affection and care she felt she had never consistently received at home, which she said was a significant part of why the relationship became so consuming and why the prospect of losing it felt so intolerable. But she also testified that Gallardo had shown her a side of himself that was frightening and controlling, that he had subjected her to threats and intimidation, and that by the period leading up to October 2011, She felt she was operating under a degree of direction and coercion from him that left her without the capacity to refuse his demands. The prosecution's response to this account was sustained and specific. They pointed to the note that Cynthia had written to Gallardo, recovered as evidence during the investigation, in which she had explicitly suggested that he harm her stepfather while he was sleeping. They presented this as evidence not of a girl being directed by a controlling boyfriend, but of a girl who was an active and initiating participant in the planning of what was to come, a co-conspirator rather than a coerced participant. The jury that ultimately evaluated this competing picture of Cynthia Alvarez sided with the prosecution's version. Gloria Villalta and Jose Lara did not approve of Gallardo and made their disapproval clear. They tried to limit the amount of time the two spent together and to restrict the nature of the relationship. Cynthia experienced this as yet another form of control layered on top of everything else she said she had been trying to escape in that home. The planning that preceded October 2011 reflected a level of deliberateness that the prosecution would later characterize in court as evidence of the premeditated nature of what the two teenagers had decided to do. On the night the killings took place, Gloria Villalta returned home from work and was attacked by the teenagers. Her body moved to a storage room within the mobile home. Jose Lara arrived home separately and was also killed. After both killings had been carried out, Cynthia and Gallardo loaded Gloria Villalta's body into the family vehicle. They drove to a Halloween party supply store and went inside to shop for items Gallardo wanted for a party he was planning. Gloria Villalta's body was in the back seat of the car during that shopping trip. They subsequently disposed of both bodies, placing them in separate shallow graves in different locations. It was Cynthia's older sister Diana who eventually raised the alarm. Unable to reach her mother by phone, over a period that became alarming, Diana contacted authorities and reported her concern. The investigation that followed connected the evidence to Cynthia and Gallardo and led to both of their arrests. The legal proceedings were conducted separately, with Cynthia and Gallardo appearing before different juries. This structure was designed to ensure that each defendant's culpability could be evaluated independently, without the risk that evidence specific to one defendant would prejudice the jury's evaluation of the other. Cynthia took the stand in her own defense. She described the abuse she said she had experienced at home, the coercive control she said Gallardo had exercised over her, and the degree to which she had felt trapped in a situation she could not navigate on her own. Her defense attorney argued to the jury that Cynthia lacked both the capacity and the initiative to have planned and executed a crime of this nature independently, and that the weight of culpability lay primarily with Gallardo. The prosecution's case rested on the note, on the evidence of Cynthia's active participation in the events of October 2011, and on the argument that the specific and deliberate nature of what had been done could not be credibly attributed to a girl with no agency in the situation. The jury deliberated for approximately 3 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on both counts of first-degree murder. Cynthia Alvarez was 16 years old at the time of her conviction in 2013. At the sentencing hearing in January of 2014, she was sentenced to 51 years to life in prison. She was 17 at sentencing. The sentence means that she will not be eligible for any meaningful parole consideration for decades. Giovanni Gallardo's separate trial produced a conviction by his own jury on 2 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a more severe outcome than Cynthia's that reflected both the jury's assessment of his role in the offense and the fact that his status as a slightly older defendant placed him in a different position under California's sentencing framework. The case generated sustained media attention in Los Angeles and nationally, and it was featured on the Oxygen Network's true crime series Snapped, which examined the full arc of events from Cynthia's background through the killings and the trial. Gloria Villalta was 58 years old. Jose Lara was 51. Whatever the truth of the relationship between Cynthia and the two adults she had grown up with in that Compton mobile home, they were people who went to work and came home and tried to manage a difficult household with a teenager who had decided, for reasons that the legal proceedings could only partially illuminate, that they were obstacles to the life she wanted, rather than people with any claim on her care or her restraint. Cynthia Alvarez is currently incarcerated in the California state prison system and will remain there for the foreseeable future of her adult life.